I began this discussion of the revolutions of 1830 and 1848 for this reason. This quote seems to encapsulate some of the problems of this time period. Von Metternich was well aware, the architect of the Congress of Vienna, that there were dangers to nationalism and French revolutionary fervor. And the worry was that if France caught a cold, if you will, or if France sneezes, if France developed a new revolution, there was a danger that it would spread to the rest of Europe. And not only do the revolutions of 1830 and 1848 prove Metternich prescient, if not correct, it also showcases the difficulty, if not the futility, of what he was trying to do in terms of restraining nationalism and restraining the French Revolution. In 1830, you see an example of Metternich being proven correct, if you will. Since the time of the Congress of Vienna, France had been ruled by a king. In this case, by 1830, it was Charles X. And Charles X was managing to upset most of the liberals within France. He had undertaken a system of press censorship, and he is undermining, if you will, the freedoms that the French liberals believe they're entitled. And so in 1830, a group of middle-class liberals rise up against Charles X, and in what is known as the Three Glorious Days, overthrow Charles X, and instead put in place a new king who is believed to be more respectful of middle-class sentiments and their freedoms. And that's important to note because the ascension of Louis Philippe, who the middle-class people like, proves that just because you're middle class doesn't necessarily mean you want or need a republic or a democracy. What they were looking for was a government that would protect the freedoms to which they felt that they were entitled. But when France sneezed, the rest of Europe seemed to catch a cold. In Poland, the uprising was by the Poles against the Russian government, and indeed they saw a connection between their uprising and that of the French, actually calling on the French government for support, which never came, and their actions were brutally crushed by the Russian government and Russian troops. In Italy, there was another example of nationalist sentiment as Italians rose up against Austrian occupation, but they also were brutally put down by Austrian troops, by military force. But in the Italian case, you can even see a connection in terms of conservatism that we talked about before. Namely, during this period, there were some revolutionaries that rose up within the Papal States, the states controlled by the Pope. And the Pope, part of that altar, that throne land altar, actually turned to the Austrians to send in troops to help put down the rebellion within his lands. And so you see there again a connection of those conservatives across nations, across borders, in order to try and preserve the stasis or the balance of power that they believed would stabilize society. Now, as we turn to 1848, recognize that this is an exceedingly complex affair. If you want a good chuckle, try looking up on Google a map of the 1848 revolutions and see as people attempt to make sense of the multifaceted, multi-ethnic, multi-dimensional, if you will, problems of the 1848 revolution that consume most of the continent. So I'm going to take France, Austria, and Germany in turn. France, again, when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. France by 1848 had started to run into problems with Louis Philippe. While he was believed to be sort of the middle class or bourgeois monarch, the middle class were growing upset with him. They felt that he was turning more to the economic elites and was not helping their interest as much. And by this time, there's also problems in society generally. The working class is increasingly upset. There's a series of bad harvests, which is leading to increased food prices, similar to 1789, the French Revolution. But more than that, there is greater worker discontent precisely because they're chafing and suffering under some of those changes of the Industrial Revolution. And so what happens in February 1848 is the middle class and the working class come together, erect barricades, and depose Louis Philippe and declare in its place a second republic. And so far, this 1848 revolution seems to be following the proper French script. The Third Estate, the workers and the middle class, have joined together, they've thrown off the forces of tyranny, and now they're creating a new government of freedom. But the problem is, in the aftermath of this success, the third estate starts to break down. And it largely starts to break down because of the cleavages that have developed between the middle class and the working class due to the Industrial Revolution. And this is underscored by Louis Blanc and the national workshops. So what happens there? Because the workers are dealing with unemployment and the like, a politician by the name of Louis Blanc proposes national workshops. These are workshops in which workers are going to be brought in, those who are unemployed, and they're going to undertake work and be paid by the government. This is the government paying workers to work. Now, this solves the problem of unemployment for the workers, but it starts to cause problems and friction with the middle class, who are upset that they're functionally paying workers to do some of these jobs, that they're being taxed to pay for this. On the flip side, the workers who come to like the national workshops grow increasingly fearful that the middle class will step in and crush their workshops. And so you start to see that over this issue of national workshops, the middle class and working class are fracturing. Eventually, out of fear, the workers storm the National Assembly and demand a new government which will protect the national workshops. And in response, the French middle class calls in the army and brutally crushes the workers' rebellion, or the workers' insurrection. And what you see here then is the break apart of the third estate, the middle class turning on the workers, bringing in military force to crush them. Power eventually falls to a new man, Louis Napoleon, but we are going to turn to him when we talk about France in a further lecture. In Austria, German liberals end up pushing for a liberal constitution and a liberal government against, well, a proper enemy. I mean, proper from the standpoint of the emperor at this time of Austria, Ferdinand, is quite weak. There's a famous story that when the German liberals are marching on the palace, when they're marching in Austria, he turns to his foreign minister, von Metternich, and says, what are the people doing? And Metternich responds, well, they are making a revolution. And Ferdinand's alleged response was, but are they allowed to do that? So he's not particularly a strong ruler, and he is quickly pushed out by the German liberals, who are demanding a new, more liberal government, new liberal constitution, things like that. And who arises to power is Franz Joseph, a ruler who promises that he will put in place a liberal constitution, who will work with the liberals to meet their desires in terms of a liberal government. The problem for Austria is that problems in terms of liberalism and conservatism fighting out bleed into people seizing this as an opportunity to try and rise up for their national interests. And indeed, this is that problem coming home to roost. When we talked about Austria at the very beginning of our lectures, our Module 1 talked about the issue of ethnic or national ethnic difference or national difference being a problem in Austrian history. This is another example of it. The Hungarians rise up against the Austrian state, as do a group of Italian nationalists. In both cases, the Austrians seek to crush it by force of arms. The Hungarian revolt is more successful than the Italian, to such an extent that the Austrian ruler, Franz Joseph, actually turns to the Tsar of Russia, asking for troops to help put down this rebellion, and the Tsar sends in over 100,000 troops to help. This is, if you will, sort of the last gasp of that old Congress system, where the conservative powers are doing all they can to stamp out nationalism, stamp out revolution wherever they find it. And if the nationalists are disappointed in Austria, so are the liberals of Germany, because after Franz Joseph has succeeded in doing away with the Hungarian threat and the Italian threat, well, he rescinds all his promises to the liberals, turns his back on them, and instead he governs as a conservative and turns away from any promises he made to the liberals. In Germany, German liberals achieve early success in pushing out local rulers and making them promise that they're going to give new constitutions, things like that. But the real hope of German liberals at this time is not simply some liberal constitutions for the respective states of Germany, but to create a true nation, a true Germany. And so, as the liberals have succeeded in pushing back or pushing out some of the rulers in their German lands, they decide to assemble and meet together at what is known as the Frankfurt Parliament. And at the parliament, they plan on hammering out and determining Germany. This sounds great. This sounds wonderful. The problem is the Frankfurt Parliament goes horribly. Rather than succeeding in their work quickly, instead the Frankfurt Parliament becomes a sort of debating society of its own making, in which people fight over defining what exactly is Germany. Does Germany include Austria? Does Germany include German-speaking lands in France, in Denmark, in the Netherlands? What constitutes Germany? And as time goes on, people grow more and more frustrated with the liberals of Germany because the German question isn't settled. People are still upset with their lot in life, and the liberals don't seem to be doing anything. When the Frankfurt Parliament finally gets its act together and offers the throne of a new Germany to the King of Prussia, the king simply responds that kings do not accept crowns from the gutter. So the question is, what should we make of these revolutions of 1848? What's their legacy? It seems that they're all failures, and indeed they are. But it might be a harsher grade to grade it on success or failure. Because if our metric of success is, oh, did they create fully fledged liberal constitutions or fully fledged nations? Well, it took many years for most nations to develop that. So we should be unsurprised that in the tenor of one single period of revolution that didn't happen. But more than that, in terms of a legacy, as we will see in later lectures, there is a pivot in terms of nationalism. Namely, the old-line conservatives like Metternich are pushed out. The old-line conservatives like Metternich who want to push back against nationalism, create a stasis system, prevent nationalism from spreading, their attitude, their tactic is found wanting. And so in the aftermath of this, there are going to be conservatives who will instead say, well, we have to reconcile with nationalism. How can we use it for our own purposes? And when we look at Italy and Germany, we'll see two examples of conservatives who do just that.